Today, I wanted to talk about and review one of my favorite indie games to come out this year, Brok the InvestiGator. I will try to keep this review relatively spoiler-free. I will touch on a few aspects of the story, although some of those things are introduced early on in the game. Other parts I'll just be very vague about. Brok the InvestiGator was released on PC, such as on Steam, on August 26, 2022. Other versions, such as on itch.io, Mac OS X, and Linux, were released shortly after. There are also plans to release this game on consoles in the near future, such as on Nintendo Switch, Xbox, and PlayStation. One of the aspects of Brok that makes it stand out and unique is that it identifies itself as a punch-and-click adventure. It's basically a cross between point-and-click games, similar to old Sierra games or the Sam & Max series, as well as 2D beat-em-ups. It might seem like putting together two very different genres may clash, but Brok actually does it very well. The game does have very flexible options such as difficulty and controller options, which I personally recommend using a controller when playing this game. One strength of Brok the InvestiGator is that it feels like it's very accessible. Its problem solving is more straightforward, not to say that it's too simple, but mostly that it's not too complicated. There's even times with the game that there's multiple ways to solve a problem, and it felt very gratifying to figure things out instead of getting stuck and frustrated due to a very complicated answer that some point-and-click games tend to have. The combat is also a fun aspect to the game, and I feel like it complements it very well. I personally like beat-em-up games myself, and I play this game on a normal difficulty. Not sure how the easier or harder difficulties are, but it does seem like these options help for players who may be more intimidated by the game's combat. Also, the game can give you tips to help with the puzzle solving. I'll get into more tips and tricks later on in the review, but wanted to mention that aspect. For those who may be a little put off by the puzzling aspects of point-and-click adventures, or the combat in beat-em-up games, I feel like Brok the InvestiGator does it well so it's not too intimidating, but it still delivers a fun challenge and experience. Moving on to the game's story, which its setting can be described as somewhat of a futuristic light cyberpunk era, where all the citizens are anthropomorphic animals. The privileged live under a dome protected by the world's pollution, while others struggle to survive. There is a divide of the citizens, somewhat of a higher and lower class. Those who live in the dome are known as drummers, and those outside are known as slummers. Also, technology and even robots have become a part of everyday life. The game's focus is on the main character Brok, a former championship boxer, now private detective, and handyman. Part of his backstory is that a few years ago, his wife died in a mysterious accident, and he is now in care of her son, Graf, who has built a father-son relationship with. Graf is a 16-year-old cat who's going through what can be called as a school so that he can become a drummer and move up in society. Brok is doing his best as a freelance investigator to support himself as well as his son. I didn't want to get too much involved in the game's story and spoil it, but I did enjoy it a lot. I will admit that there's some elements of the story that aren't 100% original, such as the societal divide as the world is falling apart, the mysterious ways the government is watching over everything, and struggles to overcome adversity. But I do feel like Brok the InvestiGator does put together a really great story. One thing that immediately drew me to this game is seeing the artwork and character designs. It seems to be very inspired by early 19 cartoons, such as shows you will see on Disney like Tailspin, Darkwing Duck, and Bonkers. On top of completely loving the character's design, I really love the voice acting as well. I feel like it's done very well. I would even say it's the game's greatest strength, and its voices do a really great job at fitting these characters that they're portraying. To be honest, I mistakenly thought that the character Wes, which is a police chief, sounded a lot like Nick Offerman's voice on Axe Cop, and even Dr. Meek reminded me of the fish from American Dad. The voice acting, as well as the art style, is very charming and feels nostalgic, but at the same time also feels new. Even though the game's aesthetic can be adorable and endearing, the game's story can surprisingly be heavy at times, such as struggling to have a better life and trying to do the right thing, which can result in failing, leading Brok to disappoint and even hurting others. Another highlight of the game is having multiple endings based on the choices you make. It does feel like the choices you make in the final chapters of the game hold more weight into what ending you get, but choices you make throughout the game will still make a big impact, such as Brok's relationship with Graf, using a more violent approach when overcoming obstacles, or how well Graf does in school and trials with becoming a drummer. The game does do a good job at making these multiple endings feel different and unique. They can range from feeling hopeful, to charming, to bittersweet, to weird, even dark and tragic. One ending even provides a trigger warning before viewing. Going back to the gameplay, it starts with Brok as the main playable character, but after Chapter 1, you can switch back and forth between the character Graf. I would say the biggest differences with these characters is that Brok's portions tend to have more combat, while Graf is a little bit more puzzle focused, especially with his school trials. Brock the InvestiGator touts being a mash of point and click and beat 'em ups. I would say it blends those elements pretty well for a cohesive experience. With the main gameplay, you can toggle back and forth from an adventure or investigative mode to an action or combat mode. This allows the players to jump and even throw a punch, which can help reveal secrets, items, or even solve a problem. The main reason why you wouldn't be able to switch between these two modes is when you're in a direct fight. Also, a helpful tip when it comes to picking up consumable items, while in adventure mode, Brok will add an item to the inventory, but in action mode, he will immediately consume it. Speaking of helpful tips, the game features a mechanic which involves these collectibles called ads. There are a limited number of them defined in the game, some easy and some more tricky. By using them, you'll get a hint on what to do next or how to solve a problem. Usually, they provide a slight hint, but you can use multiple ads to get stronger clues or guidance on how to solve the puzzle. I do feel like how it's implemented, it does provide a good balance ranging from giving a little help to providing the answer, depending on what the player decides when using these ads. The game does offer multiple save slots, so you can always save and reload to avoid using up your limited supply of hints. I do strongly recommend not jumping to these hints right away and have fun trying to solve these puzzles and obstacles, but it does do a great job of guiding the player when stuck versus looking online for a walkthrough and getting a straight answer, especially if there's multiple ways to go about it. Also, there is a bonus for collecting all the ads in the game, which is an additional scene at the game's ending. As I played through the game, including an additional playthrough and looking up guides online, I was surprised to see how often there was multiple ways to go about it. There are choices you can make that can help avoid a fight altogether, and other methods you can do to progress that I didn't even think of doing. I don't want to spoil it, but in Chapter 4 with Brok's portion, you can do something to completely skip the investigation that I thought was really cool. I also strongly recommend playing the game blind and make choices that are natural to you. I did find it fun to replay the game to see how things played out with making different choices, some changing up the events and dialogue, and some impacting which ending you get. Some other things that impact the replayability of Brock the InvestiGator is that they have options such as selecting a chapter, skipping dialogue that's already been heard, and even skipping Graf's trials. I really appreciate these quality of life choices, especially with replaying the game. It can almost feel like speedrunning the parts that you already played until you get to new branches or paths. After you beat the game and reached an ending, the game will indicate the impact of your choices on additional playthroughs. You'll see in the top corner an icon pop up as you proceed, such as violence points, brain points, and relationship points with other characters. Also, you can now open up a summary of your playthrough, which helps the player keep track of branching choices and points. I would say that the impact of your choices are usually obvious, but this is a great way to keep track of things, especially when trying to reach a specific or different ending. There's also an additional scene after getting all 11 endings, so that definitely adds to replayability. So now, I want to talk more about the game's combat, and this is where more of my criticisms of Brock the InvestiGator begins. To be honest, I feel like the combat is the weakest part of the game. That being said, I did still find it really fun and enjoyable. I would honestly say it's better than a lot of indie beat-em-up games out there. While the combat is far from simple, there's aspects such as different moves, weapons, and leveling up, but I do feel like it could have a little bit more depth to it. For example, some things I would like to see is stuff like being able to grab and throw at enemies, learn new combos and skills, if leveling up had a little bit more to it. Each time that Brok levels up, the game gives you a choice to upgrade either health, strength, or special. I would prefer getting a set of points to allocate to different stats, such as attack, defense, speed, whatever. With looking at this as an indie title from a small developer, I feel like it's unrealistic to expect more complexity, and the combat aspect is still really fun. I have been following the developer on Twitter and saw that there's a combat update in the works, maybe possibly getting the game ready for the later console release. I definitely plan on revisiting Brock the InvestiGator when the combat update is out, and it's good to know for those who got the game close to its release. Again, I did really enjoy the fighting aspect in Brok, but I feel like it's not the game's greatest strength. Also, I did want to talk about the art and visuals a little more. Although I really adore the artwork and character designs, I feel like there's some room for improvement. For examples, I feel like the combat animations, and animations in general, could use a few more frames. Another thing I feel that can use a little bit more polish is maybe more details with the characters and backgrounds, which at times can feel a little flat. With the game's art being 2D, that may be typical, I just wish it was amped up a little bit to make it pop a little bit more. I honestly do feel bad making these criticisms about the game's art because I do really love it and would have to say it's one of the strongest aspects of Brock the InvestiGators. I just feel like there's potential for it to be even better. As much as I love the story and presentation, I wish there was a little bit more to it, such as animated cutscenes. The game does rely on the characters' typical dialogue animations and models to move the story along. However, there are fun moments in the game such as when Brok wakes up from a nightmare, when Brok is sharing a meal, or selfie with Graf. It really shows off some great artwork and I wish we saw more of that. Actually, there are a handful of these moments, but it would be cool to see a little bit more cinematic animations, a little bit more than one still frame for these moments. Again, with such a small developer and team, I think it's unrealistic to expect more polished artwork and animation with this game, but I really do love the finished product and find it quite impressive. One last criticism I have of Brock the InvestiGator is that the game can feel a little small at times. For an indie game, it does have a good amount of playtime, especially with replaying to explore other choices and outcomes, but I do wish other aspects were expanded upon. To me, it seems like the cast of characters is a little lacking. I would like to see more of the residents that live in the slums or under the dome. There are a few moments where you do see a variety of different background characters, but for the most part it does feel like the game focuses only on a handful of main characters. I also feel like the number of locations can seem pretty small. With the world building of the game's story, it would be cool to see a lot more areas than what we actually do see. Another thing I would like to see are more investigations outside the main story. I really did love Brok's segment in Chapter 4, and think it would be really cool to break away from the overall narrative from time to time, with more cases to solve on the side. To be fair, I think it's a lot to ask for from a small indie developer to make a game much bigger and grander than what's reasonable with the limited resources, but I would like to see a lot more of Brok the InvestiGator. Maybe even seeing this game become a series that gets bigger and even better over time. Also to note, the game does make it clear that there's a canonical ending, and it seems like the developer does have planning to do more with Brok, looking at one of their posts on Twitter. I really do hope to see future installments of Brok the InvestiGator and see the game grow as a successful indie series. So in conclusion, I really do love Brok the InvestiGator and give it my highest of recommendations. I love the art, I love the concept, and it has a great story. Some elements of the story may not be 100% original, but Brok delivers an experience that's unique, memorable, and fun. Although the game does have this cartoonish charm, it doesn't mean that some of the story beats can get a little heavy at times. This game does make great choices to make it more accessible to different types of players. The puzzles aren't overly complicated or frustrating, and players can use hints to avoid getting stuck. If players are intimidated by the combat, the difficulty can be changed to accommodate. There's different ways to solve puzzles and overcome obstacles, some can even lead to avoiding a fight altogether. It adds more to the experience and replayability to see how the different choices you make affect the story and the ending that you get. On top of the art, I love the voice acting and consider it to be one of the highlights of Brok the InvestiGator. Part of me even wishes that there would be cartoon shorts or something so I can see and hear more of these great characters. Even though I really enjoy and adore this game, I did have my share of criticisms. I wouldn't say that my criticisms are about pointing out the game's shortcoming, but to point out opportunities of how the game can be improved and just simply wanting more of it. I have seen many criticize the combat in Brok the InvestiGator, and I can see how that aspect can feel like a weaker part of the game, but I still really enjoyed it a lot and feel like it was implemented really well. Plus, with a combat update in the works, I know I will definitely come back to revisit this game. When looking back at my time with Brok the InvestiGator, the game felt small in some ways, such as a limited amount of characters and locations, however it didn't feel too short, especially with wanting to replay and explore different choices. Considering this game was made by a very small indie developer, it can't be a huge and expansive experience, However, what the game delivers is really quite impressive. I really do hope to see more of Brock the InvestiGator. I really want to see new installments and this becoming a series that gets even better over time. I'm glad to see the initial success of this game's launch and excited to see what comes next. I will have links below if you want to check out my playthrough of Brock the InvestiGator, as well as link to the Steam page and such. Let me know in the comments below what you think of this game, and thanks so much for watching.